The station at Harlan's Crossing was not much of a station. It was a platform of weathered boards, a ticket window that closed at 4 o'clock, and a narrow overhang that kept maybe half the rain off you if the wind wasn't blowing sideways. There was a bench. There was a rusted iron stove in the small waiting room behind the window, but no one had lit it, and the door to that room was locked. A hand-lettered sign nailed to the door said, "The next westbound train came through on Tuesdays and Fridays." It was Wednesday. Elena sat on the bench with her bag between her feet and her hands folded in her lap and tried to think. The problem was that she didn't have much to think toward. Behind her was a 900-mile trip back to a city that had made it abundantly clear it had no use for her. Ahead of her was whatever this place was. A town, she supposed, though she could only see a livery stable, a dry goods store with a faded awning, and what looked like a saloon from where she was sitting. The mountains in the distance were going purple in the early evening light, and they were beautiful, she supposed, if you were the kind of person who could afford to notice beautiful things. She was not at the moment that kind of person. She pulled the letter out of her pocket. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. She had the words memorized. But she held it because it gave her hands something to do. Dear Miss Cross, we write with great enthusiasm regarding your application to join our household. We are in need of a capable woman of good character to assist in the management of our home and the education of our children. We believe you are exactly the sort of person we have been seeking. She had believed it too. That was the embarrassing part. She had given up her room at Mrs. Paulson's boarding house. She had sold her sewing kit, the good one, the one with the ivory-handled scissors her mother had left her, to cover the train fare. She had written a careful letter to her friend Agnes in Cincinnati, explaining that she was starting over, that things were finally turning around, that she would write again once she was settled. She had not told Agnes about the part where she arrived at the Hargrove house after 900 miles, and Constance Hargrove had looked at her from the doorway. Really looked at her coat and her bag and her face and the way she was standing, and said very pleasantly, "We've had a change in our circumstances. I'm afraid the position is no longer available." And then she had closed the door. Elena had stood on that step for a good 30 seconds. She could hear children inside, at least 2 of them, maybe 3, arguing about something. She could hear a clock ticking somewhere. She could hear her own breathing. Then she had picked up her bag and walked back to the station and bought a ticket for the next train out, which turned out to go in the wrong direction. And here she was. She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. The wind was coming down from the mountains now, cutting through her coat in a way it hadn't an hour ago. She would need somewhere to sleep. She had $4, which meant she could probably afford a room for 1 night, maybe 2 if the town's single hotel, assuming it had one, wasn't asking much. After that, she didn't know. She was still sitting there working through this when she heard the boots on the platform. He came from the direction of the livery, a tall man with the kind of walk that said he was tired but wasn't going to admit it. He had a hat pulled low against the wind and a canvas jacket that had seen considerable use, and he was carrying a child on each side. 2 girls, maybe 7 or 8 years old, one hanging off each arm with the comfortable weightlessness of children who had been carried like that their whole lives. Elena watched him without meaning to. There was something about the way he moved with the 2 of them attached to him, like it had never once occurred to him that it was awkward or heavy. He set them both down on the platform and said something she couldn't hear, and they went pelting off toward the far end of the boards while he turned to check the posting board near the ticket window. He glanced over at her. She looked away. She was not in the mood to be looked at. She heard him cross the platform anyway. Not quickly. Not the way men cross distances when they were coming with a purpose. Just the easy, unhurried way of a man who happened to be walking in that direction. "Missed the 4 o'clock?" he said. "I didn't miss it," Elena said. "I was on it. I got off." A pause. "You get off on purpose?" "No." She thought about leaving it there, but the answer was so bare and strange that she added, "I was supposed to meet someone. They didn't want to be met." The man looked at her for a moment. He had dark eyes, the kind that were hard to read in flat light, and a jaw that hadn't been shaved in a few days. He didn't look like he was trying to figure her out exactly. He looked more like he was doing a simple piece of arithmetic. "Family?" he said. "No. An employer. I'd answered an advertisement." She straightened slightly. "They changed their minds." "Just now? Today?" About 3 hours ago. And the next train west doesn't come till Friday. That's what the sign says. He took that in. He looked out at the mountains for a moment, then back at her. You got somewhere to stay? I'll find something. The hotel closed last fall. Calhoun, that's the owner, his wife got sick and they went to stay with her people in Tucson. Hasn't opened back up. Elena looked at him. The hotel is closed. Yes, ma'am. Is there anywhere else? Mary Sutton takes in boarders sometimes, but she's got her sister visiting from Denver. Not sure she's got room. He took his hat off and resettled it in a way that seemed more habitual than useful. There's the saloon, but you don't want to sleep there. No, Elena agreed. I don't. The two girls came running back from the far end of the platform. They were identical. Same dark hair, same gap where a front tooth had recently been, same slight breathlessness. And they arrived in a tumble of elbows and voices. Papa, Nora said the mountains look like sleeping bears, but they don't. They look like waves. They look like bears and waves. They can look like both. Papa, which is it? Both, the man said, without hesitation, and both girls seemed to find this entirely satisfying. Then they noticed Elena. The one who'd been arguing for bears looked at her with frank curiosity. Who are you? Nora, the man said. I'm just asking. My name is Elena, Elena said. Elena Cross. I'm Nora, the girl said. That's May. We're twins, but not identical, even though everyone says we are. She appeared to reconsider this. Well, we look the same, but we're not the same. I understand the distinction, Elena said, and she meant it, and something in the way she said it made the girl smile. The man was watching this exchange. He put his hand out to Elena. Cole Mercer. She shook it. His hand was rough and dry, and he didn't squeeze too hard, which she always took as a mark in a person's favor. You said you're looking for work, he said. It wasn't entirely a question. I was. The position fell through. What kind of work? She looked at him. There was nothing in his face she could particularly object to, no particular hunger in it, no angle she could identify. He seemed to be asking what he appeared to be asking. I can manage a household, she said. I can teach basic reading and arithmetic. I can cook adequately. I can keep accounts if you show me the system you're using. I've done most of it at one point or another. Cole Mercer looked at his daughters, who were both now watching Elena with the focused attention of animals who have spotted something new in their territory. I've got a ranch about 4 miles out, he said. My wife passed 18 months ago. I've been managing the girls and the work at the same time, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not managing either of them especially well. He said this the way a man says something that costs him a little, plainly, but not comfortably. I've been looking for someone to help with the house and the girls, someone who could stay. I haven't found anybody that lasted more than 3 weeks. Elena looked at the two girls. Nora had her arms crossed and her head tilted, assessing. May had moved slightly closer, not obviously, but Elena noticed it. What happened to the others? Elena asked. Too far out, too quiet, too much work. He paused. Or they didn't get along with the girls. We're not that bad, Nora said. Nora. We're mostly not that bad. Elena might have smiled at that. She wasn't certain. I can't speak to the quiet or the distance, she said slowly, because I don't know yet what either of those things looks like out here. But I've lived in quiet places before. And I'm not especially afraid of work. She stopped. I should tell you I have $4. I can't pay in advance for anything, and I don't know when I'd be able to repay you for a room or board. That seems like a thing you ought to know. I wasn't going to charge you, Cole said. I was going to offer you a position. Starting when? He looked at her with something that was almost amusement. I've got a wagon out front. I was heading back tonight. Elena looked down the platform. The sun was behind the mountains now, and the cold was settling in for real. She thought about Mrs. Hargrove's pleasant face and her closed door. She thought about the $4 in her coat. She thought about the sign that said Friday. She stood up and picked up her bag. All right, she said. The wagon road was rough, and the wind had picked up, and one of the girls, May, the quieter one, fell asleep against Elena's arm about a mile out, her small weight settling into Elena's side with a trustfulness that Elena found unexpectedly hard to receive. She sat very still so as not to wake her. Nora was on the other side of her father, asking him questions about something that had happened at school, a disagreement with a boy named Terrence, who had said something about her drawing that she found objectionable. He said it looked like a sick dog, Nora said. It was a horse. What kind of horse? Cole asked. A running one. They're hard. They are hard, he agreed. What'd you say to him? I said his face looked like a sick dog. Cole appeared to be making an effort not to laugh. That's not great, Nora. He started it. He did. And now you both said something unkind. Nora considered this with the serious expression of someone running a fair accounting. Mine was worse, she finally admitted. Little bit. Because a sick dog face is worse than bad art. Little bit. A silence. Then, I'm going to draw a better horse tomorrow. Good idea. Elena was listening to all of this with her face turned toward the dark fields going by, the dry grass catching the wagon lantern in quick silver flashes. It was the kind of conversation she had not been part of in a very long time, small and functional and warm in the way that only ordinary things can be warm. She was careful not to make anything of it. She was good at that. She'd had a lot of practice. The ranch was not what she expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Not something large or grand, that would have been ridiculous to expect out here, but not something quite so bare and tired looking either. The main house was solid. She could see that even in the lantern light. Good timber, real glass in the windows, a porch that ran the full length of the front. But there were boards gone from the fence along the near pasture, and the yard had the slightly overgrown look of a place where the work of keeping things neat had slipped down several places on a very long list. There was a barn, big enough for the work of the ranch, and she could hear cattle somewhere in the dark beyond it. A bunkhouse sat off to the left, light showing in two of its windows. Cole helped the girls down and carried May inside without waking her. Elena took her bag and followed, which was an odd feeling. Following a stranger into a house that was not hers, in a place she'd never been, having decided to stay based on about 10 minutes of conversation and the fact that she had nowhere else to go. She was not by nature someone who made decisions this way. She did not entirely know what to make of the fact that she had. The inside of the house was better than the outside. Someone had built good furniture, a table, chairs, a real settee in the main room, and there were signs of a woman's hand that had not been entirely undone by 18 months of a man managing alone. A braided rug on the floor, curtains that had faded but were still hanging, a shelf of books, which Elena noticed immediately. Cole came back from the girl's room and found her looking at the shelf. My wife's mostly, he said. Abigail. She read a lot. She read everything she could get her hands on. He said it without particular grief. Not that the grief wasn't there, but it had settled into something different, something that had changed shape with time. The girls don't read well enough yet to get through most of them, but they won't let me put any of them away. I wouldn't either. He looked at her. You want to see your room before I show you anything else? Please. It was a small room off the kitchen, not much larger than a closet really, but there was a real bed in it and a window that would let in morning light and a hook on the wall for her coat. Someone had put a quilt on the bed. It was old and slightly faded, and it was probably the most comforting thing Elena had seen in 3 days. It's not much, Cole said from the doorway. It's a room, Elena said. It's fine. He stayed in the doorway a moment, as if he wanted to say something else, and then he said, I appreciate you taking a chance on this. I know it's not what you came out here for. Elena set her bag at the foot of the bed. She thought about the Hargrove door, and the 900 miles, and the $4. She thought about May falling asleep against her arm with that easy, unguarded trust. I don't know what I came out here for, she said honestly, but I needed to be somewhere. And your girls seem like good company. Cole Mercer almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way, but it was close. Get some sleep, he said. I'll show you around the operation in the morning. He closed the door, and she heard his boots move down the hall. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with her hands on her knees. $4. A closed door. And now this. A room in a stranger's house. A quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. A pair of gap-toothed twins who looked at her like they were making up their minds. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook. She was awake before the light came. Old habit. She'd been waking early since she was 12 years old, and mornings were the only quiet she was guaranteed. She dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen, found wood stacked by the stove, and had a fire going by the time she located the coffee in the pot. She was standing at the window with a cup in her hands when she heard boots in the back hallway. Cole came into the kitchen, stopped when he saw the fire and the coffee, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know, I was awake." He poured a cup and stood at the other end of the counter, and they were quiet for a moment with the stove ticking and the sky outside the window going from black to gray. "I should tell you something about the men," he said. "The ranch hands. There's 4 of them. Good workers, most of them, but they're not used to change. We haven't had anyone in the house since Abigail." He turned his cup in his hands. "Webb especially. He's been here longest, thinks he has something to say about how things are run. He probably won't be welcoming." "Is he dangerous?" Cole looked up. "No, not like that. He's just opinionated." "I can manage opinionated," Elena said. "I believe you," Cole said, and this time the almost smile came out a little further than it had the night before. "Breakfast'll go a long way. He's got a weakness for good biscuits." "I can make biscuits." "Then you'll be fine." "What?" She met Webb at breakfast. He was a short, thick man of maybe 50, with a face like old leather and hands that looked like they had been worked until they forgot what else hands could be used for. He came in through the back with 2 of the other hands, young men named Dix and Carver, who had the good manners to take off their hats. And he stopped in the doorway when he saw Elena at the stove. He looked at Cole. "Who's this?" "Elena Cross. She's going to be helping with the house and the girls for a while." Webb looked at Elena the way a man looks at a problem he's been given but wasn't consulted about. "Where from?" "Back east," Elena said. She set a plate on the table. "Biscuits are ready. Coffee's on." Webb continued to look at her for another moment. Then he sat down, took a biscuit, and ate half of it in silence. "Good?" said Dix, who was young enough to be cheerful. "Pass me another," Webb said, to no one in particular. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't a fight either, and Elena had learned a long time ago to take what was on offer. The girls came in from their room a few minutes later, May still half asleep, and Nora already talking about something she'd thought of in the night. They sat on either side of Elena without discussion, as if seating arrangements had already been settled. Webb noticed this. She saw him notice it. He didn't say anything, but he watched. The day was long and full. Cole showed her the house, the cellar, the chicken coop, the kitchen garden. Not much growing this time of year, but the beds were there, and with work they'd come back. He showed her where things were kept, what needed fixing, what had gone to the bottom of the list too long. There was more than she would get to quickly. She didn't say this. She was already sorting it in her head. In the afternoon, she sat with the girls at the kitchen table and asked them what they were studying. "Reading," May said, "and sums. And Mrs. Finley makes us do penmanship, which is terrible." "Why is it terrible?" "Because she makes us hold the pencil in a certain way that hurts my hand," Nora said. "And if it's not perfect, she makes you do it again." "Is your penmanship bad?" "Mine's all right," May said. "Nora's is very bad." "It's not very bad," Nora said. "It's somewhat bad." "Can I see?" Elena asked. Nora produced a sheet of paper from somewhere. Apparently she carried it around, which Elena found interesting, and handed it over. Her writing was large and uneven, letters leaning in different directions like they hadn't agreed on which way to go. "It's not very bad," Elena said. Nora looked vindicated. "It's somewhat bad," Elena said. "Your letters are the right shape. They're just not agreeing with each other yet. That's fixable." "Can you fix it?" "You can fix it. I can show you how to practice." Nora considered this like a negotiation. "Will it hurt my hand?" "Not if we do it the right way." "All right," Nora said, with the air of someone granting a significant concession. May watched all of this with her quiet eyes. At dinner, she sat next to Elena again. When Elena handed her the butter, May said quietly, so that only Elena could hear, "Are you going to stay?" Elena looked at her. May was watching her with a directness that was startling in a 7-year-old, or maybe it wasn't so startling. Children were often more direct than the adults who were supposed to be managing them. "I intend to," Elena said. "The last one said that too," May said. "She left after 2 weeks." "What happened?" May was quiet for a moment. "She didn't like it here. She said it was too far from everything." She looked at her plate. "I don't think she liked us very much." Elena was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Well, I've already seen that you're good company, so that's not going to be the problem." May looked up at her. Something in the girl's face shifted slightly, like a door opening a crack. "Okay," she said. Just that. But she picked up her fork and ate her dinner, and when Elena got up to clear the plates, May helped without being asked. Gate. Later, when the girls were in bed and the kitchen was clean, Cole came in from his last check of the evening and found Elena at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, making a list. "What is that?" he said. "Things that need doing. I put them in order of urgency." She turned the paper so he could see it. "The fence near the south pasture is the most urgent because if it goes further, you'll lose stock. The root cellar door needs a new hinge. The girls are behind in arithmetic. Not badly, but enough to matter. The kitchen garden needs to be turned over before the next frost, or you'll have a harder time in spring." Cole looked at the list. He looked at it for a long time. "I know some of this," he said. "I know you know it. I just didn't want to lose track of it in my head." He sat down across the table. He looked tired in the way of a man who has been tired for so long he doesn't know what the other condition feels like anymore. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said, "for coming. I know this isn't what you were looking for." She thought about this Hargrove door. She thought about the letter with its soft folds. She thought about what she had told May and whether she meant it and decided that she did. "Maybe not," she said, "but it's not nothing." He nodded. He seemed to understand that she wasn't fishing for more than that, and he didn't offer it. He just got up, took his cup to the sink, and said goodnight. She sat for a while longer with her list and the stove fire and the sound of the wind outside, working its way down from the mountains in long, cold reaches across the dark land. She was in a stranger's house, in a country she didn't know, with $4 in her coat and nothing behind her she wanted to go back to. But the girls had sat on either side of her at dinner without being asked, and the coffee had been good in the morning, and the room, small as it was hers, at least for now. She folded her list and set it on the table where she'd see it in the morning and went to bed. The list was still on the table when she woke up. She'd half expected to come into the kitchen in the gray early light and find that it had somehow disappeared overnight. That the whole evening had been one of those exhaustion-induced moments of poor judgment that looked different in the morning. But there it was, her own handwriting, the pencil lines a little faint in places where she'd pressed too softly. The stove had gone cold. She got it going again, filled the pot, and stood at the window while the water heated, watching the sky do what it did out here. None of the gradual urban brightening she was used to, where light came in between buildings and softened everything by degrees. Out here, the dark just ended. One moment the land was a black shape against a slightly less black sky, and then the sun came over the eastern ridge and everything was suddenly there, sharp-edged and present, and without apology. She had 4 items crossed off her list by the time Cole came in for breakfast. He stopped in the doorway the same way he had the morning before, that slight hesitation of a man who keeps expecting to walk into an empty kitchen and keeps not doing it. He looked at the stove, at the coffee, at the pot of oatmeal she'd found in the back of the pantry, and improved with what remained of a jar of dried apple. "You don't sleep late," he said. "Never have." She handed him a cup. "I need to ask you some things about the root cellar. The hinge is worse than I thought. The door's pulling away from the frame on the top corner. If you lose that seal before winter, everything you've put up will freeze." He sat down. "I've been meaning to get to it." "I know. It's on the list." She sat across from him. "I can fix the hinge if you show me where you keep your tools. I've done it before. But if the frame itself is rotted, that's a different conversation." Cole looked at her over his cup. "You can fix a door hinge. I can fix most things that are straightforward. The ones that aren't, I'll tell you." "Where'd you learn that?" "My father," she said. "He didn't have sons, so he taught me." She said it the way she said most things about her family, plainly, without color, the way you talk about facts that have stopped having the power to hurt you, or that you've decided to treat that way. He said a woman who can fix things doesn't have to wait around for someone else to fix them for her. Cole nodded, like this was a reasonable position. "He sounds like a practical man." He was. She got up and spooned the oatmeal into bowls. "He died when I was 19. That's when the practical part stopped working as well as it had. She said it without asking for anything, and Cole heard that and didn't offer anything. Just made a small sound of understanding and picked up his spoon. She appreciated that. A lot of people, when you gave them a piece of information like that, felt obligated to do something with it. Cole Mercer apparently understood that some things didn't need to be built on. The girls came in from their room already arguing. "You took my hair ribbon," Nora announced, to the room in general. "I didn't take it. I borrowed it," May said. "Borrowing is different. Borrowing means asking first." "I didn't want to wake you up." "Then you should have waited until I woke up. Your ribbon was right there, and mine is somewhere, and I couldn't find it. That's not my problem." "Girls," Cole said, without raising his voice, and both of them stopped. It was impressive, Elena thought, the way he didn't have to be loud to be heard. "Sit down and eat." They sat. Nora still had a look of genuine grievance on her face. May was doing the thing Elena had already identified as her particular habit, looking at her own hands when she knew she was in the wrong, like if she examined her fingers carefully enough the conversation might move on without her. "May," Elena said. May looked up. "Ask next time." "Yes, ma'am." "Nora." Nora looked at her, slightly surprised at being addressed. "After breakfast, we'll find your ribbon, and then we'll find a place to keep yours where May can't accidentally borrow it again." She said accidentally with exactly the right amount of deliberate weight, so that both girls understood she was being generous with the word, and both of them understood she knew it. "Sound fair?" Nora considered this. "Fine," she said, in the tone of someone who had won something but was choosing to be gracious about it. Cole caught Elena's eye across the table. He said nothing, but something in his expression shifted. Not gratitude exactly, more like the quiet relief of a man who has been handling something alone for a long time and has just been handed a second pair of hands. Okay. The tools were in the barn, well kept in a way that spoke to a man who respected his equipment even when other things had slipped. Elena found what she needed for the hinge, and Cole walked her to the cellar to show her the situation, and it turned out the frame was fine. Solid timber, no rot, which meant the job was straightforward. She was on her knees working on it when she heard boots coming around the corner of the house. She already knew, by the weight and rhythm of them, that it wasn't Cole. Webb stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way he'd looked at her at breakfast the day before, measuring something, though she wasn't entirely sure what. "What are you doing?" he said. "Fixing the cellar door." She didn't look up from what she was doing. The top hinge was pulling away. "If it goes, you lose the seal." A silence. "I can do that," Webb said. "I know. I'm already doing it." She drove the screw and tested the hinge. Good. She moved to the next one. "If you want to help, you can hold the door while I set this side." Another silence, this one longer. She could feel him deciding something. Then he came over and held the door. They worked without talking for a few minutes. She was aware of him watching what she was doing, not in a hostile way exactly, more in the way of a man who has decided to reserve judgment, but hasn't entirely put it away. "Where'd you come from?" he said finally. "Back east." Cole said that. "I mean originally." "Ohio," she said. "Originally." "What brought you out here?" "A job that didn't work out." She set the last screw and tested the door. It swung clean and sealed tight, and she was satisfied with it. She stood up and brushed the dirt off her knees. "So now I'm here." Webb looked at the door. He looked at her. "Cole's a decent man," he said. "I can see that. He's had a hard stretch. Those girls have had a hard stretch." "I know." "I don't know what you're looking for," Webb said. "But if it's something other than what you're being paid for, I'll tell you straight that I'll be watching." Elena looked at him. She wasn't angry. She understood it, actually. Understood it better than he probably expected her to. He'd been here a long time, and he'd watched something he valued get broken and put back together imperfectly, and now a stranger had appeared, and he didn't trust it. "That's fair," she said. "You should watch. I'd do the same." She picked up the tools. "Lunch will be ready at noon. I'm making soup from what's left in the pantry, which isn't much, but it'll be hot." She went back inside. She heard him stand there for a moment, and then she heard his boots go back toward the barn. It wasn't trust, but it wasn't a fight. She was starting to think that on this particular piece of land, that might be the best way things moved, slowly, in small increments, earned rather than offered. She could work with that. She'd worked with worse. The days settled into a shape. She was up before light. Coffee, fire, whatever the pantry offered for breakfast. The girls came in and she managed them through the morning routine with a firmness that was consistent enough that after 3 days they stopped testing it, which was its own kind of efficiency. Cole ate quickly and went out. The hands ate in the bunkhouse mostly, but sometimes Dix and Carver came to the kitchen door and she fed them without ceremony. Webb ate in the bunkhouse. He came to the kitchen door once for coffee when the bunkhouse stove was having trouble, and she gave it to him and didn't make anything of it. The fourth ranch hand she'd seen only at a distance, a thin, weathered man named Holt, older than the others, who moved around the edges of the operation like smoke and didn't appear to need much from anybody. In the afternoon, she sat with the girls. Nora's penmanship was improving, not because Elena was forcing her hand into a particular position, but because she'd figured out that Nora was pressing too hard from the shoulder instead of moving from the wrist. And once she showed her the difference, Nora took to it with the focused energy of a child who has been told there is a specific thing wrong and a specific way to fix it. She liked problems that had solutions. May was the opposite. She was better with things that were open, stories and questions without clean answers, and Elena learned to give her those and let her roam in them. In the evening, she caught up on everything else, mending the curtains, reorganizing the pantry, going through the root cellar inventory, writing out a list of what they'd need from town before the serious cold hit. She slept. That was the thing she noticed most. She had not slept this consistently or this heavily in years, and she wasn't entirely sure whether it was the physical work or the air or the simple fact of having enough to do that the thoughts didn't get too loud at night. Maybe all three. On the 6th day, Cole came in from the pasture in the middle of the morning, which wasn't his pattern, and Elena knew before he said anything that something had happened. "Lost 2 calves last night," he said. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "We think something got into the south section. A cat maybe, or coyotes working together. Webb's out looking at the fence now." "The south fence is the one on the list," Elena said. "Yeah." He put his hands flat on the table. He was tired in a different way than his usual tired. This was the particular exhaustion of a setback. The kind that doesn't just take your energy, but takes some of the forward motion with it. 2 calves it's not good. Not right now. She didn't ask him to quantify what not right now meant, because she'd been going through the pantry and the cellar, and she had a reasonable sense of the margins they were working in. She had been adding things up in her head for 6 days without saying anything, because it wasn't her place to say anything, and also because she didn't yet know enough to be sure of what she was adding. "How's the rest of the herd?" she said. "Okay, we got them up to the near pasture. Webb thinks if we reinforce the south section and run a watch for a few nights, we can stop it from happening again." He looked at the table. "It's just, this time of year every loss counts." "I know." He looked up at her. "Sorry to dump this on you. It doesn't have anything to do with Cole." She said his name without thinking, and then was mildly surprised at herself for it. "You don't have to apologize for telling me what's happening on your own ranch." He looked at her for a moment. "Right," he said. "Okay." She put a cup of coffee in front of him and went back to what she'd been doing, which was working on the inventory. She was quiet, and he was quiet, and the kitchen held both of them without requiring them to fill it, which was something she was learning was one of the things she liked about this particular house. It was solid enough to hold silences without making them feel like something that needed to be fixed. After a while, he said, "What are you writing?" "Inventory. What's in the cellar, what's in the pantry, what we need before the cold comes." She turned the paper so he could see it. "I put the prices I knew next to the things I could estimate. For the ones I didn't know the cost, I left a blank. You can fill those in." He looked at the list for a long time. It was organized by category, so food stores, household goods, things for the girls, items for the ranch work, and it had a running column of estimated costs on the right side. "You did this in your spare time," he said. "It needed doing." "Elena." He looked up from the paper. "I hired you to manage the house and help with the girls." "I know. This is more than that." She looked at him. "Do you want me to stop?" He looked back down at the list. A long pause. "No," he said. "No, I don't." He pulled the paper toward him. "I'll fill in the blanks." Hush him. She found out about the town's opinion of her by accident. She'd taken the wagon in on Saturday to pick up a few things from the dry goods store. Cole had offered to go, but she'd said she might as well learn where things were, and he'd let her take it. It was a short trip, the road reasonable in the dry weather, and she'd been glad of the hour alone with the sky and the flat land and the mountains going white at their tops. The dry goods store was run by a man named Pullman and his wife, Dorothea, who had the kind of cheerful efficiency that suggests a person who has organized both their store and their opinions about the world into a system that runs smoothly and doesn't require much outside input. She was friendly enough to Elena, helpful about prices, generous with the brown paper bags, but there was something in the way she looked at her that was doing more than just looking. It was when Elena was on her way out that she heard it. She had stopped at the door because she'd realized she'd forgotten to ask about salt, and before she could turn back, she heard Dorothea in conversation with a woman who'd come in while Elena was paying. A woman Elena didn't know, someone from town or the surrounding area. "Cole Mercer's hired a woman from back east," Dorothea was saying, in the tone of someone relaying interesting news to an audience who will find it appropriately interesting. "Showed up stranded at the station, apparently, and he just brought her home." "Without knowing anything about her?" the other woman said. "That's what I'm told. Holt says she doesn't talk about where she came from or why she was stranded." "Do you think he's—" The woman lowered her voice, but not enough. "I mean, is this a practical arrangement, or—" "I honestly don't know," Dorothea said, with a delicacy that suggested she had several theories. "But he's got 2 little girls in that house, and if she's the kind of woman who'd show up at a train station with nothing and go home with a strange man—" Elena went back in and asked about the salt. The silence when she appeared was complete. Dorothea recovered quickly, found the salt, told her the price. The other woman had developed a sudden interest in a display of ribbon near the window. Elena paid, said thank you, and left. She sat in the wagon for a moment before picking up the reins. She had known this was coming. She had been waiting for it the way you wait for a change in weather you can read in the clouds. Not hoping to be wrong, just hoping it will hold off long enough to get the work done. She had come out of nowhere, with nothing, and gone home with a widower and his children, and the people of this valley had their own logic about what that meant, and no amount of explaining would shift it quickly. The question was whether she was going to let it shift her. She picked up the reins and headed back toward the ranch. She didn't tell Cole what she'd heard. He had enough on his mind. The south fence was taking longer to repair than expected, and there was a problem with one of the older mares that the animal had been keeping private from everyone until she couldn't anymore. And Webb was being quieter than usual, which Cole had told her, when she asked, meant he was worried about something. "He goes quiet when he's working something out," Cole said. "It's actually better than when he's talking." "He hasn't said anything directly hostile to me in 6 days," Elena offered. "That's his version of warming up." She wasn't sure that was encouraging. What she did do was start making herself known in ways that required no explanation. She sent a pie with Cole when he went to meet with a neighboring rancher named Patterson about the shared water line that ran through both their properties. She sent biscuits with Dix when he rode into town for supplies, because Dix was young enough that people would talk to him freely about whatever they wanted, and it didn't cost her anything to be generous. She started going to town herself every Saturday, and every time she did, she was exactly who she was. She didn't push, didn't explain herself, didn't apologize for existing. She asked Pullman about the roads, asked Dorothea about the best place to find good wool fabric for the girls' winter coats, said good morning to people and good afternoon, and meant it without requiring them to mean it back. People made up their minds on their own timeline. She'd learned that. Pushing only made them dig in. What she hadn't expected was the Harlan family. Ruth Harlan ran what passed for the community's informal network, not by design apparently, just by the force of knowing everyone and caring about most of them, and having a kitchen that was always warm and a pot that was always on. Elena met her when Ruth came out to the Mercer Ranch uninvited one Thursday afternoon with a jar of put-up tomatoes and the stated purpose of welcoming the new arrival. Elena, who had been in the middle of getting the girls through their arithmetic, answered the door and was so surprised by both the visit and the stated purpose that she was momentarily without words. "Don't look at me like I'm a threat," Ruth said. She was a round-faced woman in her 50s with calloused hands and a direct gaze, and she handed over the tomatoes like they were a business transaction she wanted to get through before moving on to the real conversation. "I'm Ruth Harlan. I've known Cole since he was nobody much, and I knew Abigail, and I thought someone should come out and say welcome instead of standing around town wondering what you're about." "Please come in," Elena said. Ruth came in and looked at the kitchen with the assessing eye of someone who knows what a house looks like when it's being looked after versus when it isn't. She looked at the girls, who had looked up from their arithmetic and were now watching Ruth with the cautious curiosity of children who have seen this kind of visitor before and are waiting to see which kind she is. "You must be Nora and May," Ruth said. "I'm Nora," Nora said. "She's quieter." "I can see that." Ruth sat down without being asked, which was the kind of confidence Elena respected. "What are you working on?" "Fractions," May said with the tone of someone naming a disease. "Terrible things," Ruth agreed. "You want the trick?" May looked at Elena. Elena made a small gesture that meant go ahead. May looked back at Ruth and said yes. Ruth Harlan spent 40 minutes at Elena's kitchen table helping the girls with fractions, and she did it in a way that was both practical and completely unhurried, and Elena thought, this is a woman who has been useful her entire life and never once decided that meant she had to be important about it. When the girls went back to their room and Ruth and Elena were alone with the last of the coffee, Ruth looked at her and said, "People are talking." "I know," Elena said. "Most of it's nothing. People talk when something new happens. It usually settles." "And when it doesn't?" Ruth looked at her cup. "This valley has a memory," she said. "It's not always fair about what it remembers, but it's generally fair about what it sees." She looked up. "The question is whether you're going to give it something worth seeing." "That's the plan," Elena said. Ruth nodded with the brisk satisfaction of a woman whose judgment has been confirmed. "Good. Then you'll be fine." She stood up and smoothed her apron. "I'll tell Frances Doyle to stop worrying about the girls. Frances tends to catastrophize." "What is she catastrophizing about?" "She thinks you came out here looking for a husband." Elena looked at her. "I told her that a woman with your kind of sense wouldn't cross 900 miles for something she could have found closer to home," Ruth said. "She wasn't entirely convinced, but she'll come around." She picked up her shawl. "Cole's a good man. The girls are good girls. This is a good piece of land if someone tends it." "It is," Elena said. Ruth stopped at the door. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Ruth considered this. "Someone softer. Someone who'd need more managing." She looked at Elena for a moment longer. "Come to the Harlan place any Saturday you're in town. The door's always open." She left, and Elena stood in the kitchen for a moment with the jar of tomatoes in her hands. She thought about Dorothea Pullman's lowered voice, and Frances Doyle's worries, and Ruth Harlan's kitchen with its always open door. She thought about the way this valley watched and waited and made up its mind at its own pace. She thought about the list on the table and the girl's arithmetic and Webb, who had held the cellar door without being asked and had not yet decided what she was. She put the tomatoes in the pantry. She went back to the kitchen table and picked up the fractions. The night it almost came apart was a Wednesday, 3 weeks in. She'd been asleep, really asleep, the kind that comes from genuine exhaustion, when she heard May in the hallway. Not crying, just standing there, which was in some ways worse. Elena got up and found her in the dark outside the kitchen, her feet bare on the cold floor. "What's wrong?" Elena said. "I had a bad dream," May said. Her voice was steady in the way of a child who has decided not to be dramatic about something that is nevertheless bothering her considerably. "I dreamed about Mama." Elena stood still for a moment. This was not the territory of biscuits and arithmetic and cellar hinges. This was something else. "What happened in the dream?" she said carefully. "She was leaving. She kept walking away and I was trying to follow her, but the ground kept changing." May looked at her feet. "I know it was just a dream." "Dreams aren't always just dreams," Elena said. "Sometimes they're the mind working something out." May looked up at her. "Do you dream about people who left?" Elena thought about her father, about other people and other leavings. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes. Does it stop? The dreams or the missing? A pause. Either. The dreams get less frequent, Elena said. The missing, it changes. It doesn't stop, but it changes into something different, something that doesn't feel as much like a hole. May absorbed this. Then, can I sit in the kitchen for a while? Yes, Elena said. I'll make us something warm. She heated milk on the stove to be some. There wasn't much of it. The cow was at the end of her season, but there was enough, and they sat at the kitchen table, the two of them, while the stove ticked and the wind worked at the windows. May wrapped her hands around the cup. She didn't say much, and Elena didn't push. The girl just needed to be somewhere warm with someone present, which was a need Elena understood from her own body, from her own particular history of rooms she'd sat in alone waiting for the night to change its mind. After a while, May said, I'm glad you stayed. Elena looked at her. In the stove light, the girl's face was soft and young and old at the same time, the way children's faces are when they're carrying something too heavy. I'm glad too, Elena said, and it was true, more true than she'd expected when she said it, truer than most things she'd said in recent memory. May finished her milk and went back to bed without ceremony, and Elena sat alone in the kitchen for a little while longer, listening to the house hold itself together in the dark, the way houses do when you're awake to hear them. She thought about Ruth Harlan's parting words. This is a good piece of land if someone tends it. She thought about what it meant to tend something. Not just the fence and the cellar and the pantry inventory, but the harder, less visible work. The sitting with a child at midnight, the holding of things that couldn't be listed, the being present in ways that didn't show up anywhere but that everything depended on. She had come here with $4 and a broken promise and the sensation of a door closing behind her. She was still not sure what she was building or whether it would hold, but the girls slept in the next room and the house was warm and she was still here. For now, that was the whole answer. The first hard frost came on a Tuesday, which nobody had predicted and everybody felt. Elena woke to a stillness that was different from the usual morning quiet, heavier somehow, like the world had pulled a tight layer over itself in the night. She went to the window and saw the yard silver white in the pre-dawn, every blade of grass individually coated, the fence posts wearing a thin rime along their tops. Beautiful, yes, in the way that things are beautiful when they're also dangerous. She was already calculating before she was fully awake. The kitchen garden, the root cellar door seal she'd fixed, but that would need to be checked again, the water line that ran from the well to the barn. She had the stove going and was pulling on her second layer when she heard Cole already in the barn, his voice low and carrying in the cold air, talking to someone. Webb, she thought, from the answering register. She put the coffee on and went out. The ground was hard underfoot in a way it hadn't been the day before, and her breath came out in small, visible clouds. She got to the barn door and pushed it open and found Cole and Webb standing at the far end by the water trough, which had a thin skin of ice across it that Cole was breaking with a stick, while Webb watched with the expression of a man confirming a thing he'd already known. "How's the line?" she said. Both of them turned. Webb looked at her with the slightly startled expression she'd noticed he got whenever she appeared. Somewhere he hadn't expected her, which she'd come to think of as his version of adjusting. "Probably fine," Cole said. "It's insulated down to the main, but if it stays this cold, we'll need to check it morning and evening." He looked at Webb. "I'll take mornings." "I'll check evenings," Elena said. Webb looked at her. "You know where the line runs?" "I walked it with Dix 2 weeks ago," she said, "when I was figuring out where the water goes in winter." Another adjustment. Webb looked at Cole, then back at the trough. "I'll check the south section," Webb said finally, which was his way of accepting a division of labor without explicitly agreeing to it. They went their separate directions in the thin silver-white morning, and Elena went back to make breakfast, but the frost stayed in her mind. It was early for this. She knew enough by now to know it was early, and early first frosts sometimes meant hard winters. And hard winters on ranches that were already running lean had a way of turning small problems into larger ones before you'd finish dealing with the smaller ones. She was thinking about this when Dix knocked on the kitchen door, which he did now with the comfortable frequency of someone who has decided the kitchen door is a reasonable place to knock. "Morning," she said. "Coffee's ready?" "Thank you, ma'am." He came in, sat at the end of the bench, took the cup she offered. He had his hat in his hands and he was turning it in a slow circle, which she'd learned meant he was working up to something. She waited. "There's some talk," he said. "In town, about the water." She set down her own cup. "What about it?" "The creek that runs through the Patterson property. You know the one. It's the same line that comes through here on the east side. It's running low. Has been for a few weeks. Patterson's been complaining about it." Dix turned his hat another half circle. "And there's others further down the valley saying the same thing. Doyle's Place, the Harlan East section, all pointing back to the same source." "The upstream," Elena said. "Yes, ma'am. And there's a new operation set up north of Patterson. A man named Grint came in maybe 4 months ago, bought a piece of land that used to belong to old Bauer before he sold up and left. Nobody's said it out loud yet, but people are thinking it, thinking that Grint is pulling more than his share." "Yes, ma'am." She looked out the window at the frozen yard. The water situation was something she'd put on the list in a different form, check east water line in winter. But she hadn't had enough information to put it further, hadn't known enough about the valley's water network to see what she was looking at. Now she was starting to. "Does Cole know about Grint?" she said. "He knows Grint bought the Bauer place. Don't know if he's connected it to the water." "Thank you, Dix," she said, "for telling me." Dix nodded, put his hat back on, and went out. She heard him cross the yard to the bunkhouse, and she stood for a moment at the window, adding things up. "Tom," she told Cole that evening. He was tired. They were all tired, the kind of tired that set in when the cold came early and the work didn't slow down to match. But he sat at the table and listened while she told him what Dix had said, and she watched his face do the thing it did when he was taking something seriously, a slight stillness, like he was putting the moving parts of himself on hold so he could think clearly. "Grint," he said. "You know him?" "Met him once, at the feed store." He was quiet for a moment. He's the kind of man who shakes your hand and looks over your shoulder at the same time. "Has Patterson talked to you?" "Not directly. He sent word that he wanted to meet. I've been putting it off because—" He paused. "Because every time I talk to Patterson, it costs me half a day and my patience, and I've had less of both than usual lately." "You might want to stop putting it off," Elena said. Cole looked at her. "I know. If the water situation is what Dix thinks it is, it's going to get worse before it gets easier, and the people downstream from Grint are going to start pointing fingers at whoever's closest before they start pointing them at the actual cause." She kept her voice even, but she was thinking about what she'd seen in the valley in the weeks she'd been here. The way the ranches sat in relation to each other, the way water moved through the land, the way people moved through their opinions. The Doyles and the Harlans are already talking about it. Ruth Harlan mentioned the creek running low when I saw her Saturday. "All si basi shaky." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't know yet what it meant. Now I do." She looked at him. "Patterson first, and soon." Cole sat with his hands flat on the table, so that thing he did when he was making a decision, like he needed to feel something solid. "I'll send word tomorrow." She nodded and started clearing the table, and Cole sat for a moment longer before he got up and helped her, which he had started doing recently without either of them deciding he would. It was one of those small shifts that happen in a house when the people in it start working alongside each other instead of adjacent to each other, and Elena noticed it the way she noticed most things, clearly and without making anything of it out loud. The meeting with Patterson happened on a Saturday, which meant Elena was in town with the wagon and the girls while Cole rode out to the Patterson place. She'd taken the girls to Ruth Harlan's for the morning, which had become something of a habit. Ruth had a daughter a few years older than the twins, who was apparently the only person Nora would willingly lose an argument to, and May liked the Harlan kitchen with its particular kind of busy warmth. Elena went to the dry goods store. She went to the post office. She was crossing the street toward the wagon when she heard her name said in a way that was not a greeting. "Miss Cross." She turned. There were 2 women she half recognized. She'd seen them at the store before, knew them by sight, but not by name. The one who'd spoken was younger, probably 30, with a tight expression that said she'd been working herself up to something. "Mrs. Elena said. "Alderman," the woman said. "Clara Alderman. My husband has land north of the Mercer Ranch." She said it like it established something. "We've been wondering, some of us in the valley, about the situation out at the Mercer place." What situation is that? Elena said. The other woman, older, shifted slightly. Clara Alderman didn't. About you, she said. Being there, with Cole and those girls. A woman from outside, no family here, no connections. Nobody who can speak to your character. She said character the way people say it when they mean something else. I don't think it's appropriate, is the thing, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. Elena looked at her. She was not angry exactly, though there was something in her chest that would have liked to be. She was more tired. Tired of it in the way you're tired of rain when it's been raining for a week. You're not surprised by it anymore, but it still gets in everywhere. My character, she said, is something you'd have to observe over time to have an opinion about. Same as anyone's. She kept her voice level. I'm sorry I don't come with someone to vouch for me. That's the situation I'm in, but I'm not going to explain myself to you in the street. And I'm going to ask you to take your concerns to Cole Mercer directly if you have them, because that's the honest way to do it. Clara Alderman's expression tightened further. People talk, she said. People do, Elena agreed. And then time passes, and usually the talking gets quieter, and what remains is just what actually happened. She picked up the wagon reins. Good morning, Mrs. Alderman. She drove to collect the girls, and she was 3/4 of the way to the Harlan house before her hands stopped being tight on the reins. Cole came back from Patterson's in the late afternoon looking like the trip had been exactly as costly as he'd predicted. He's convinced it's Grint, he said. Has been for 3 weeks. He's been waiting for someone else to say it first. Why? Because Grint's got a lawyer in Tucson. Patterson's seen the correspondence. He sat down and took off his hat and set it on the table, which was his version of announcing that something needed to be dealt with. He's prepared for someone to come at him over the water. He's got documents about water rights, easements, prior claim, the whole thing filed and ready. Which means going at him directly is expensive and slow, Elena said. Yes. Cole looked at the hat. Patterson wants to organize something. The affected ranches, a united front. He thinks if enough of us go to the county office at the same time with the same complaint, it carries more weight than any one of us going alone. He paused. He also thinks I should be the one to lead it, which I think is because he doesn't want to do the work of organizing people, and he knows I'm... He stopped. Reasonable, Elena said. People trust you. He looked at her with a slight edge of discomfort. I wasn't going to say that, but it's accurate. She sat down across from him. What did you tell him? That I'd think about it. He looked at his hands. I've got enough to think about right now. The herd, the winter, the girls. He stopped again, and she could see him seeing how that sounded and not being sure he wanted to take it back. You can think about more than one thing, she said. And the water is going to affect the herd this winter, regardless of whether you want to be involved. I know. So the question isn't whether to deal with it. It's whether to deal with it alongside everyone else or alone. Cole looked at her. He had that expression he got sometimes, the one that was harder to read than his usual ones, somewhere between respect and frustration, as if she'd said the exact thing he already knew, and he wasn't entirely at peace with knowing it. You think I should do it. I think you're the right person for it, and you already know that. She was careful here, because it wasn't her place to push, and she knew it. But it's your ranch, and your decision. He sat with it for a minute. Outside, she could hear Nora telling May something at high volume from the direction of the porch, and May responding in her quieter register, and then a brief silence, and then both of them laughing at something. Cole's face changed slightly when he heard it, the way it always did. Not a visible change, more like something in him eased by a small degree. What did you do in town? He said. She told him about Clara Alderman. She told it plainly, without drama, because it had happened and he should know. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I'm sorry. It's not yours to apologize for. It's my valley. Clara Alderman is her own person making her own choices, Elena said. It's not your fault that she made that one. She looked at him. It won't be the last time something like that happens. I want you to know that I'm not planning to leave over it. Something moved across his face. Not relief exactly, more like the careful acknowledgement of something that mattered. Okay, he said. He picked up his hat. I'll send word to Patterson. Saw. The weeks that followed were hard in a different way than the first weeks had been. The drought, and that's what it was turning out to be. Even in winter, the creek dropping further by the week and the wells showing the strain put everyone on edge in a way that personal opinions and social frictions had not quite managed. When water got scarce, tempers found their shortest distance to the surface. Dix came back from town one afternoon with a bruised cheekbone from an argument at the feed store between two ranch hands she didn't know, an argument that had started about fence lines and ended about something nobody could clearly explain. Webb, who had been moving steadily towards something like neutral ground with Elena, went quiet again. Not hostile. She'd learned to read his quiet now, and this wasn't the kind that meant he was building towards something bad. He was worried. He was the kind of man who expressed worry by going quiet and working harder, and in the weeks after the frost he was out earlier and back later than anyone. She found him at the barn one evening when she was doing her waterline check, after everyone else had gone in. "The South Trough's holding," she said. "Line's clear." Good. He was working on a piece of harness by lantern light, his hands moving with the automatic competence of a man who has done the same task 1,000 times. "Ground's harder by the east fence than it should be." "I saw that." She stood for a moment at the edge of the lantern light. "Webb." He looked up. "What are you worried about?" she said. Specifically. He looked at her. He had never quite gotten used to her directness. She could tell. Every time she asked him something without preamble, he had the same brief moment of recalibration. But he answered. He'd been answering, these past weeks, more than he used to. "This time last year we had twice the water in that creek," he said. "Abigail had put up enough that we went through winter easy. This year," he stopped. "The stores are decent. You've done good work with the cellar. But if the water doesn't come back before spring and we lose any more head." He looked at the harness in his hands. "Cole's running on margins he can't afford to lose." "I know," she said. "Do you know how close it is?" She thought about the inventory, the account book she'd asked Cole to show her 2 weeks ago, which he'd taken out with the reluctance of a man revealing something he'd prefer to keep private. She'd gone through it quietly and put it back and not said anything, because there was nothing useful to say yet. "I have a sense of it," she said. Webb studied her. "Most people wouldn't stay," he said, "knowing what the situation is." "I've been in worse situations," she said, "and I don't leave when things get difficult." She said it without defiance, just as fact. "That's something you should probably know about me by now." Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he went back to the harness. "Patterson's meeting's next week," he said, "at the Harlan place." "I know. You going?" "Cole asked me to help Ruth organize it." She paused. I said yes. Webb did not say anything to this, but he nodded once, the kind of nod that means something even when it doesn't say it. The meeting at Ruth Harlan's was on a Friday evening, and there were more people than anyone had anticipated. Elena had expected 8 or 10, the directly affected ranches, the ones whose water was already compromised. What came was closer to 20, because Ruth Harlan had a way of making people feel that an invitation to her house was something you didn't decline. And because the water situation had been simmering for long enough that a formal occasion to talk about it publicly was a relief. Elena had helped Ruth arrange the chairs and the food. There was always food. Ruth was religious about this, which Elena had long since decided was less about hospitality and more about the practical truth that people were easier to deal with when they were not hungry. And by the time people arrived, the kitchen and the front room were set up and the coffee was on, and there was enough cornbread on the table to feed the whole valley. She stood at the edge of the room and watched people come in. She knew most of them by now, at least by sight. The Doyles, Franklin and his wife Vera, who had come to a cautious neutrality about Elena over the past weeks. The older Harlan sons and their wives. 2 or 3 families she'd seen in town but hadn't spoken to directly. And Clara Alderman, who came in with her husband, a thin, quiet man who looked like he'd spent his life apologizing for things he hadn't done, and stopped briefly when she saw Elena, and then continued into the room. Elena did not move from her spot. She said good evening to people as they came past. She kept her face exactly what it was. Patterson opened the meeting. He was a big man with an orator's instincts and a farmer's distrust of anything he couldn't pick up and examine, and he laid out the water situation with the bluntness of someone who has been sitting on the information too long. The creek levels, the timing, the pattern that all pointed north to the Grint operation. "He's got rights filed," Patterson said. "That's the problem. We go at him alone, he buries us in paper before we get anywhere." "So we don't go at him alone," Cole said. He was sitting near the front, and people looked at him when he spoke with the particular quality of attention that meant they were taking it seriously. We go together, collectively, through the county water office, with a formal complaint signed by everyone affected. They can't ignore that the way they can ignore one rancher. Grint's gonna fight it, Franklin Doyle said. He's gonna try, Cole said, but there are 12 operations in this valley that share that watershed. That's not a dispute between neighbors. That's a regional issue. The county office has to respond to a regional issue. What do we need? Ruth said from the kitchen doorway. Documentation, Elena said. The room looked at her. She'd said it quietly and clearly, and without asking permission to speak, and there was a brief moment of adjustment, the way there always was when she said something in a public setting, people recalibrating, deciding whether to hear it. Water levels, she said, measured at each property over time, a record that shows the pattern. Right now we have everyone's individual impression of how low the creek is running, which is useful but not sufficient. If we can put together a document that shows the decline across all the affected properties in sequence, dates, measurements, upstream to downstream, that's not an impression anymore. That's evidence. A silence. How long would that take to put together? Patterson said. If everyone commits to measuring and recording from now, and if we can get estimates going back as far as people remember with dates, even rough dates, I can have a working document in 2 weeks. She looked at Cole. I'll need to borrow the county survey maps. There should be ones at the land office that show the watershed. Cole nodded. I can get the maps, Ruth said. Franklin Harlan's brother works at the land office and… I'll go, Elena said. If you give me the name. Another adjustment. She could feel it. The room's slight shifting, people deciding something about her. It was Clara Alderman who broke the particular quality of that silence. You do that? She said. Not hostile, genuinely surprised, which was almost more interesting. It needs doing, Elena said. And I don't have a ranch to run, so I have more flexibility than most people here. It makes sense for me to do it. Clara Alderman looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at her husband. Then she looked back at Elena and said quietly enough that it cost her something. All right. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness for what had been said in the street, but it was the first time the woman had looked at her like she was a real person rather than a problem to be managed, and Elena received it for what it was. The meeting went on for another hour. By the end, there was a plan. Imperfect, dependent on things that could go wrong, but a plan. People signed a sheet of paper that Patterson had brought, agreeing to participate in the collective complaint. Cole signed it. The Doyles signed it. Ruth Harlan signed it, and her sons. Clara Alderman signed it. Elena did not sign it, because it was not her place to. This was the rancher's business, their land, their water. But she folded the list of measurement tasks she'd assigned during the meeting and put it in her pocket, and when people were leaving and the room was thinning out, Webb appeared at her elbow. She looked at him. That was good, he said. Not warmly. It wasn't in him to be warm in public, but it was direct. And direct from Webb was worth more than warm from most people. What you did in there. The evidence idea. It was the obvious next step, she said. Maybe. He looked at the room. People needed to see it said out loud by someone who wasn't fighting for their own land. Made it easier to hear. She thought about that. She thought about the way she'd stood at the edge of the room, the way she'd chosen her moment. She had done it without entirely thinking it through, but she'd been doing it since she arrived, standing at the edge of things, watching, finding the place where she could be useful without asking for space she hadn't earned. Webb, she said. He looked at her. Thank you for holding the cellar door, she said, that first week. I don't think I thanked you properly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. You fixed the hinge, he said. I just held the door. That's usually how the work goes, she said. He walked out into the cold evening, and she went to help Ruth clear the food from the table, and the house settled around them with the comfortable noise of people leaving, the low percussion of boots on floorboards, the cold air coming in and out with the door. Get. That night, driving back to the ranch in the dark with the girls asleep against each other in the wagon bed, Cole said, You didn't have to do that. The land office. I know, Elena said. It's a long ride. 2 days probably with the roads. I know. She watched the lantern light moving on the road ahead of them. "I can manage it." A silence. The horse's hooves were steady on the hard ground, a sound she'd come to find comfortable in the way you come to find reliable sounds comfortable. Not interesting, but present. "When you said you'd do the documentation," Cole said, "and Alderman asked if you'd really do that." He stopped. She waited. "That was the moment," he said. "That was when people decided something." She thought about it. She thought about the room's adjustment, the particular quality of silence before Claire Alderman spoke. "I wasn't trying to change anyone's mind," she said. "I was just doing what needed doing." "I know," Cole said. "That's what made it work." She didn't answer that. The road went on ahead of them, the dark fields on either side of it, the mountains invisible against the dark sky, but present somehow. You learned to feel where they were, after a while. Like a weight in the world at the edge of knowing. The wagon rolled on, and the girls slept, and the cold pressed close around the small circle of lantern light, and Elena thought about the document she was going to build. The measurements, the dates, the pattern of water going away, and thought about what it meant to make the invisible visible, to turn things that had just been noticed and suffered into something that could be pointed at and said, "Here, this is what happened." She had done that with a cellar door and a list and an inventory. She was going to do it now, with water and time and maps. She was still not sure what she was building exactly, in the larger sense. But tonight, for the first time since she'd stepped off that train with $4 and a failed promise, she had the sense that whatever it was something real, something that mattered beyond just her own survival in it. The ranch came into view, a cluster of lights in the dark, small but steady, the kind of lights that mean someone is home. She guided the horse into the yard and stopped the wagon, and the girls woke up with the particular slow confusion of children coming back from deep sleep, and she helped them down and walked them to the door. And the house was warm when they opened it. It was warm because she had banked the fire before they left. Small things. She had learned in her life that it was almost always the small things. The ride to the land office took 2 days each way, and Elena did it alone. Cole had offered to send Dix with her, and she'd declined. Not out of stubbornness, but because Dix was needed on the ranch and because she was, despite the months she'd been here, still someone who preferred to do her thinking in private. The road was flat for the first half and rough for the second, and she'd packed enough for 4 days and taken the steadier of the 2 wagon horses and left before the girls were awake so she wouldn't have to manage the leaving. She'd written a note for Nora and May and left it on the kitchen table, folded with their names on the outside. She didn't know exactly what she'd put in it until she was writing it. Something about the biscuits in the tin, something about Nora's penmanship practice, something about being back before they knew it. She'd sat looking at it for a moment after she'd written it, struck by how ordinary it was, how much it sounded like a note left by someone who belonged to a place. The land office was in a county seat that was larger than Harlan's Crossing, but not by much. A proper main street, a courthouse, a telegraph office, a hotel that was actually open. Ruth Harlan's contact turned out to be a meticulous man named Briggs, who smelled of pipe tobacco and kept his files in a system so precise it bordered on the personal. He was skeptical of Elena's request at first, not hostile, just the careful skepticism of a man whose files were his currency and who did not distribute them carelessly. But she'd brought Ruth's letter of introduction and her own written explanation of the water complaint, and after he read both, he took off his glasses and looked at her. "You put this together yourself," he said. It wasn't quite a question. The description of the situation, yes. The legal framing I left vague on purpose because I don't know enough to frame it correctly. "That's more honest than most of what comes across this desk," Briggs said, and went to find the survey maps. She spent the better part of a day in his office with the maps, making careful copies of the relevant sections, the watershed lines, the upstream parcels, the easement notations going back 30 years. Briggs checked in on her twice and brought her coffee once without being asked, which she took as a positive sign. On her way out, she asked him carefully what he thought the county office would need to see in order to take a collective complaint seriously. He looked at her for a long moment. "A pattern," he said, "not impressions. Numbers." "That's what I'm building," she said. "Then build it tight," he said. "Grint's lawyer has been in this office twice already. He knows which questions to ask." She thanked him and left. and drove out of town in the early afternoon with the map copies folded in her bag and the cold air coming at her straight off the high country to the north. She thought about Grint's lawyer being in that office twice. She thought about what it meant to be prepared for something before the other side had started moving. She thought about what Webb had said. He shakes your hand and looks over your shoulder at the same time, and understood, for the first time, the specific shape of what they were dealing with. This was not a neighbor dispute. This was a man who had arrived knowing exactly what he was taking and had filed the papers to protect himself before anyone noticed what was gone. She drove back with the maps and her notes and her anger, which she kept quiet and useful the way she tried to keep most things. The document took her 10 days. She worked on it at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed, Cole sometimes sitting at the other end of the table with his own work, the two of them quiet in the way they'd gotten comfortable being quiet together. She sent Dix out with a written measurement protocol to each of the participating ranches, a simple form, date and location, and water level in the most concrete terms she could devise, inches and feet, rather than descriptions like low or very low, because descriptions were arguable and numbers were harder to dismiss. The responses came back unevenly. Patterson sent his measurements in the first 3 days, thorough and dated. The Doyles sent theirs a week later, Frank Doyle's handwriting large and careful, as if he was aware of the document's potential importance. 3 of the smaller operations sent back forms that were only partially filled in, and Elena drove to each of them herself to fill in the gaps with questions and a pencil. "You don't have to do all of it personally," Cole said one evening, watching her reorder a stack of forms. "The gaps matter," she said. "If there are gaps in the record, Grint's lawyer points at the gaps. Patterson could have someone do this. Patterson's someone would do it Patterson's way, which means it would be organized around what's good for Patterson." She looked up. "I'm trying to build something that holds for everyone. That's a different job." Cole looked at her for a moment. He had been doing this more often lately, just looking at her. Not with any particular expression she could name, more like a man who keeps encountering something he hasn't fully categorized yet. She'd started to be mildly aware of it in a way she hadn't been before, though she hadn't decided what to do with that awareness, if anything. "The girls asked when you were going to help them make the advent calendar," he said. May asked. Nora said she didn't care, which means she does. "Saturday morning," Elena said. "I already told them." Cole almost smiled. "Right," he said. "Of course you did." The document, when she finished it, was 11 pages. It had a cover summary written in plain language, what was being claimed, what the evidence showed, what the affected parties were requesting, followed by the measurement data organized by property and date, followed by the survey map copies with the watershed lines marked in red ink. At the end, she had written a 2-paragraph section on the history of the water easements as recorded in the county office, citing Briggs's files by date and document number. She put it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. It was not a legal document. She knew enough to know that. It would need to be reviewed by someone who understood how these complaints were formally filed. But it was thorough, and it was clear, and it told a story that was hard to argue with if you were paying attention. She took it to Ruth Harlan the next morning. Ruth read it at her kitchen table in 20 minutes of complete silence. Then she set it down and looked at Elena. "Where did you learn to do this?" she said. "I didn't," Elena said. "I just thought about what would be hard to argue with and tried to make something that was hard to argue with." Ruth looked at her for another moment. "I'm going to send this to my cousin in Flagstaff," she said. "He's a land attorney. He can tell us what it needs and file the formal complaint." "That's what it needs," Elena agreed. Ruth set her hands flat on the table. The same gesture Cole made, Elena noticed, and thought this was probably something the Valley had in common. "This is going to matter," Ruth said, "what you've done here." "We'll see," Elena said. "Grint's lawyer has been at the land office twice." "Then we're glad you got there first." Mugged. The crisis came not from Grint, but from the weather. January brought a cold that was different from the early frost. Harder, more sustained, the kind of cold that gets into wood and stone and does not leave for weeks. The creek that had been running low went lower. 2 of the smaller operations lost cattle, not to the cold itself but to the complications it created, animals already weakened by the thin water access and the shortened grazing season. The Doyle place lost a section of barn roof in a wind event that nobody had predicted, and Franklin Doyle, already strained, made the mistake of going into town angry and saying things in the feed store that got back to 3 different people before noon. What he'd said, Elena heard from Dix was that the water situation was being handled too slowly, that the people downstream should have acted sooner, and that whoever had been in charge of putting together the documentation had taken too long doing it. She heard this on a Thursday afternoon when she was in the middle of stretching the winter food stores as far as they'd go, recalculating what they had and what they'd need and where the gaps were. She put down her pencil and sat with it for a moment. Then she went on with what she'd been doing. Cole heard the same thing that evening and came home quieter than usual. He didn't say anything about it directly. He wasn't that kind of man. But she could feel the shape of it in the kitchen, the way it was sitting between the walls of the house. "He's scared," she said. "Franklin Doyle. He lost stock and he lost part of his barn, and he doesn't know how to be scared without being angry at something." Cole looked at her. "That doesn't make it less unfair." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She picked up her pencil. "But I know what I did and how I did it. And the document is right, and the timeline was as fast as it could be without cutting corners that would have made it useless." So, Cole said. "So I'm going to keep working," she said. He sat down across from her and picked up the list of stores she'd been working through and read it without a word. After a few minutes, he said, "We can stretch the grain further if we cut the feed ratio for the older stock first and watch them daily. Webb knows which ones can take it." "I'll talk to Webb tomorrow," she said. They went on working. The real crisis, when it arrived fast. It was a Wednesday in late January, and Elena was in the kitchen with the girls. They were doing geography, which Nora found fascinating and May found tolerable, when she heard Holt's voice in the yard, which was unusual enough that she went to the window. Holt was the ranch hand who never raised his voice, and he was raising it now, calling for Cole and the specific quality of it, not panic, but urgency stripped of everything unnecessary, brought Elena to the door before she'd consciously decided to move. "What is it?" she said. Holt turned to her without hesitation, which told her how serious it was. "East water lines burst, the main one, below the frost line. Something shifted in the ground. We've got water running out into the east field, and the trough in the far barn is already going dry." He said it in the clipped, efficient way of a man who has assessed the situation and is delivering the facts before the feelings. "Cole's out at the south section. I sent Carver to get him." "How much water do we have in the near barn trough?" "Maybe enough for a day and a half." Elena looked at the field. The temperature was sitting at something that made her lungs feel the air as a physical object. Water running free in that cold would freeze wherever it settled, and frozen standing water in the wrong place could compromise the ground for the rest of the winter. "We need to stop the flow first," she said. "Can you show me where the line runs?" Holt looked at her for a moment. The same look she'd gotten from Webb that first week. The quick calculation of what this woman actually knew. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." And she went back inside long enough to tell Nora, firmly and clearly, that she was in charge until an adult came back, that May was to keep working on the geography, and that under no circumstances was either of them to come outside. Nora, who had heard enough of the exchange at the door to understand that something real was happening, did not argue. She pulled her sister back to the table with a seriousness that made Elena, briefly and with no time to examine it, proud of her. The waterline problem was bad but not catastrophic, which was the best that could be said. Holt showed her where the break was, a section of the underground line where the ground had shifted, probably from the freeze-thaw cycle, and the joint had given. The water was running out through a depression in the east field and had already formed a sheet of ice over a 20-foot area that crunched unpleasantly underfoot. "Can we shut it off at the main junction?" Elena said. "Yes, but then we lose water to both barns." "We lose it anyway until this is fixed," she said. "Shut off the main. Let's stop making the ice problem worse first and deal with the repair second." Holt went to the junction. She stood in the field and watched the flow slow and stop and tried to think through the order of operations. The break was deep enough that digging to it in this cold was going to be serious work. They'd need to move the cattle in the far barn to the near one or supplement their water manually until the line was repaired. The ice sheet needed to be dealt with before someone or something went through it. Cole arrived at a run, which was unusual for him. She'd never seen him run before, and it did something to her chest briefly that she filed away to think about at a better time. "What happened?" He took in the ice field and Holt standing at the junction and Elena in the middle of it all, and seemed to process everything at once. She told him quickly and in order. He listened without interrupting. "Okay," he said when she'd finished. "Okay?" He looked at the field. "Webb knows how to repair the line. He's done it before. But digging it out in this temperature, we need 4 people minimum, rotating," Elena said. 2 digging, 2 warming up, switching every 20 minutes. If you push longer than that in this cold, the work gets worse, not better. Cole looked at her. "I've seen it before," she said. "In Ohio, before I left. A neighbor's well line, same problem, same weather." "You helped repair it?" "I was 17 and my father was one of the 4 people rotating," she said. "I was not very useful, but I remember how it went." Something shifted in Cole's face. He looked at her, and at the ice field, and at Holt, and made the calculation that was there to be made. "All right," he said. "Let's get Webb." Bob. They dug in shifts through the rest of that afternoon and into the evening, and Elena was one of the 4. Cole had looked at her when she'd put on the extra layer and picked up the second shovel, and she'd looked back at him with the expression she'd learned to use when she'd already decided something and was not going to be redirected, and he'd let it go. The work was brutal. The ground was hard as iron for the first foot and only marginally more cooperative below that, and the cold got into your hands through the gloves and into your lungs through your scarf, and there was no comfortable way to be in it, only a way to keep moving so the cold didn't win. Webb directed the digging with the economy of a man who has done hard physical work long enough that he doesn't waste energy on anything that isn't the task itself. And Elena followed his direction without comment and did what was useful and stayed out of the way of what she couldn't help with. At one point, rotating out to warm up, she found herself standing in the barn with Dix and Carver, all 3 of them trying to get feeling back in their hands, and Dix said, wonderingly, "You can really dig." "Anyone can dig," she said. "You just have to be willing to keep going when it stops being comfortable." "Most people aren't," Carver said. "Most people haven't had enough practice at things they didn't want to do," she said. Dix laughed at that, a real laugh, unexpected, and the warmth of it in the cold barn was its own small restoration. They got to the break by 7 in the evening. Webb repaired it by 9. It was not elegant. A field repair never was. It was a thing meant to hold through the winter until it could be done properly in spring. But it held, and when they opened the main junction again, the line ran clear, and the trough in the far barn began filling with the slow, reliable sound of water doing what water was supposed to do. Elena stood in the barn and listened to it and felt, in a very specific and unadorned way, the satisfaction of a thing that had been broken being repaired. Not fixed perfectly. Repaired. There was a difference. Webb was cleaning the tools on the other side of the barn. He looked over at her. "Good call," he said, shutting off the main first. "It was the obvious thing," she said. "You keep saying that," he said, "about things that aren't obvious to most people." She didn't have an answer for that. She started cleaning her own tools. It was Ruth Harlan who told her about the talk. Ruth came by the following Saturday, ostensibly to bring a jar of preserves and check on how the ranch had come through the cold snap. But Elena could tell from the moment she came in the door that there was something else. Ruth had a way of carrying news, not gossip. Ruth Harlan was not a gossip, but real information that she thought you needed to have, that showed in the slight set of her jaw. They sat down with coffee, and Ruth told her. "Franklin Doyle has been talking," she said. "What he said at the feed store, that was just the start. He's been saying the water document took too long, that whoever put it together didn't know what they were doing, that it's your fault the complaint wasn't filed sooner." She paused. "And there are a few people who are listening, the aldermans, a couple of the smaller operations who don't know better." Elena held her cup. "The document is right," she said. "I know it's right. Briggs knows it's right. My cousin wrote back to say it was as good a foundation as he's seen put together by someone without legal training, and he asked twice who had done it." Ruth looked at her. "But right and persuasive are 2 different things, and right now the people who are scared are listening to the person who is angriest, and that's Franklin Doyle." "What does he want?" Elena said. "I think he wants someone to blame," Ruth said, "because the alternative is that he's in a difficult situation and no one is to blame, and that's harder to sit with." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Is Cole hearing it?" "He'll hear it soon if he hasn't already." She thought about Cole. She thought about the ranch and the line they were walking, and what it would cost him if the community he needed to work with turned against the process because they needed someone to be angry at. "I'm going to talk to Doyle," she said. Ruth looked at her. "That might not—" "I know," Elena said. "It might make it worse. He might not listen, or he might dig in harder because a woman he already half distrusts is the one going to him." She looked at her coffee. "But I built that document, and I know what's in it, and I know why the timeline was what it was. And if there's a conversation to be had about that, I'd rather have it directly than let it run sideways through every feed store in the valley." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You want me to come with you?" "Yes," Elena said. "I think it would help." Ruth nodded, with the decisive nod of a woman who has made up her mind and is not going to reconsider. "Tuesday," she said. "I'll drive." The Doyle place was smaller than the Mercer Ranch, but denser. Everything packed closer together. The buildings arranged with the pragmatic logic of a man who had never had extra space and had learned to use what he had. Elena noticed, as they drove in, that the barn roof repair was underway, temporary boards nailed over the gap, the whole thing waiting for weather that would allow proper work. Franklin Doyle came out to meet them, with the wariness of a man who has been talking about someone and is now looking at them. Ruth said good morning with her usual directness. Elena said good morning and looked at the barn roof. "How bad is the damage inside?" she said. Doyle blinked. "Lost some equipment. Hay was ruined in the northwest corner. Enough to matter for the winter?" "We'll manage," he said slightly stiffly. "We've managed before." "I know you have," she said. She looked at him. "Mr. Doyle, I understand you have concerns about how the water documentation was handled." He looked at Ruth, then back at her. She could see him deciding something, whether to say what he'd been saying secondhand to her face or to retreat to something more cautious. He was not a coward. She could tell that about him, so he said it. "You took too long," he said. "While you were building your document, we were losing water. I lost 2 head. I lost that roof section because the structure's been stressed for 2 seasons, and I didn't have the resources to reinforce it the way I should have because this valley's been bleeding water for 6 months. "You're right that the drought has been going on for 6 months," she said. "The documentation covers 16 weeks of it. The remaining time predates when anyone had organized measurements, which is why the earlier sections are reconstructed from memory and dated estimates rather than precise readings." She kept her voice even. Not apologetic. That would be wrong because she hadn't done anything wrong. But not defensive either, just clear. "If I had started later and rushed it, the gaps and inconsistencies would have given Grint's lawyer exactly what he needed to invalidate the whole complaint. I chose thorough over fast because fast would have cost us more in the end." Doyle looked at her. He was not a man who changed his mind quickly. She could see that. He had the look of someone who had spent his life being right about difficult things and found it hard to consider that he might have been wrong about something easier. "My cousin reviewed it," Ruth said. "He's a land attorney. He said it was solid." "One attorney," Doyle said. "One attorney who handles exactly these kinds of cases and has for 20 years, Ruth said, with the particular firmness of a woman who has run out of patience for a specific kind of stubbornness. "Franklin, I understand you're in a hard stretch. I understand you're angry. But this woman has been working on this valley's water problem for 2 months without any stake in it, except that she thinks it's right. And she went to the land office herself and built you a document that gives us the best chance we've had. And I'd like you to extend her the basic courtesy of saying so." A silence. Doyle looked at Elena. She looked back at him and did not fill the silence, because the silence was his to fill. "The timeline might have been what it had to be," he said. "It came out slowly, like something being moved from one place to another that was heavier than expected. I don't know enough about how these complaints work to say otherwise." "It was," Elena said, "but I understand why the weight was hard." He looked at the barn roof. "We'll see how the complaint goes," he said. "That's the proof of it." "Yes," she said, "it is." They didn't shake hands, but he walked them back to the wagon, and when they were leaving, he said to Elena specifically, "That water line on your place, the one that burst, I heard you helped dig it out." "I did my shift," she said, "in that cold." "It needed doing," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not warmth. That would come later, maybe, or maybe never. Some people weren't built for warmth across the gap of a disagreement. but something that was at least honest. Right, he said. Yeah. They drove away, and Ruth was quiet until they were a quarter-mile down the road. That went better than I thought it would, Ruth said. He's a reasonable man, Elena said. He was just scared. You're good at seeing that. Elena looked at the road ahead. I've been scared before, she said. It helped to have someone be clear with me rather than careful. Ruth made the sound she made when she was thinking something she had decided not to say yet, and they drove back through the cold, flat land, the mountains ahead of them going blue in the middle distance. The county water office received the formal complaint filed by Ruth's cousin in the second week of February. The response came back in 3 weeks, slower than anyone wanted, but faster than anyone had dared expect, acknowledging the complaint and opening a formal review of water usage in the affected watershed. Grint's operation would be required to submit documentation of its extraction within 60 days. Cole told her over dinner, the girls at the table, the kitchen warm. It's not over, he said. The review could take months. Grint's lawyer will challenge everything. But it's open, Elena said. It's open, he confirmed. May looked up from her plate. What does that mean? It means someone with authority is now officially paying attention, Cole said. Which is what we needed. Nora considered this. Did Elena do that? Elena helped do that, Cole said, along with a lot of people in this valley. Nora looked at Elena with an expression that was more complex than her usual assessments. Something older in it, something that recognized the weight of a thing without being entirely sure what the thing was. Okay, she said, and went back to her dinner. It was, Elena thought, approximately the right response. Later, after the girls were in bed and the kitchen was quiet, Cole was standing at the window with his coffee, and he said, without turning around, Webb told me about the water line. What you did. I did my share of the digging, she said. He fixed the actual break. He said you kept your head when it would have been easy not to. He turned around. He also said you were the one who told Holt to shut off the main first, which stopped the ice problem from getting worse. It was the obvious, Elena. He said her name with a directness that stopped her. Stop saying it was obvious. It wasn't obvious, and you know it wasn't. She looked at him. He was standing by the window with his coffee and his tiredness and his steady way of looking at things, and she understood suddenly that he wasn't just talking about the water line. All right, she said. It wasn't obvious. No, he said. It wasn't. He didn't say anything more than that. He finished his coffee and said goodnight and went down the hall, and she sat at the kitchen table with her list. There was always a list, and the stove warmth and the quiet house around her. She thought about the document and the water line and Franklin Doyle's slow, reluctant concession and the county office's letter and Nora's complicated look at dinner and May sleeping in the next room. She thought about what had been required and what she'd given and what it had cost her and what it had not. She thought about the morning she'd arrived, the platform, the $4, the closed door. She was still not the same person who had sat on that bench. She wasn't sure she could have told you precisely when the change had happened, because it hadn't been one moment. It had been the cumulative weight of days, each one requiring something, each one returning something slightly different than what had been asked. That was how it worked, in her experience. That was how most real things worked. She put her list away and went to check that the stove was banked properly, and the back door was latched against the wind, and the water line was holding. She'd been checking it every evening since the repair. A habit now. And when she came back inside, she stood for a moment in the kitchen in the dark and the quiet and let herself feel the full weight of the place. It was not hers. She knew that. The ranch was Cole's. The land was Cole's. The history of it was Abigail's. And before that, whatever came before Abigail. And Elena Cross had arrived 6 months ago with nothing and had built exactly what she'd been able to build with what she had. But she was here, and what she'd built was standing. For tonight, that was enough. The county review took 4 months. Elena knew it would. She had told Cole when the acknowledgement letter came that 4 months was optimistic and 6 was more likely, and she had been right about the optimism and wrong about the pessimism. The formal determination arrived on a Thursday in early June, carried by the regular mail rider, and Cole brought it in from the road still sealed and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, which told her everything about how much it mattered to him that the thing inside be what they needed it to be. The girls were at school. Webb was in the barn. The kitchen was quiet in the particular way of mid-morning, when the early work is done and the afternoon work hasn't started yet, and the light came through the east window at the angle Elena had come to associate with this hour, this season, this specific place on the earth. "Open it," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move. She picked it up and opened it herself because one of them had to, and read it standing at the table. The review had found, based on the documentation submitted by the collective complainants, that the Grint operation had been drawing water in excess of its recorded easement rights. The excess draw was quantified. The number was close to what Elena had estimated when she'd done the calculations herself in February. Sitting at this same table at midnight while the stove ticked and the house slept, Grint would be required to reduce his draw to the recorded easement level immediately, install a metered monitoring system within 90 days, and submit to quarterly reviews for 3 years. The affected downstream properties were entitled to apply for compensation through the county agricultural office for documented losses during the period of excess draw. She read it twice, then set it on the table and looked at Cole. He read it. She watched his face while he did. The careful stillness of it, the way his jaw changed slightly when he got to the compensation paragraph, the exhale at the end that was too long and too controlled to be ordinary. He set it down. "That's it," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's it," she said. He put his hand over his face for a moment, not breaking down, not the kind of man who did that, but allowing himself one private second of something he hadn't let himself feel while the outcome was still uncertain. Then he dropped his hand and looked at her and said, "Thank you." She shook her head. It was the Valley's complaint. Everyone participated. "The document was yours," he said. "The land office trip was yours. Talking to Doyle was yours." He looked at her steadily. "You can share the credit, Elena, but don't pretend you weren't the center of it." She looked at the letter on the table. She thought about Briggs in the land office with his pipe tobacco and his careful files. She thought about the measurement forms coming back in Franklin Doyle's large, careful handwriting. She thought about the 4 months of waiting, of checking the water line every evening, of keeping the forward momentum in the house while the ranch held its breath. "All right," she said. "I helped." "You did more than help," Cole said. He was still looking at her in that way he'd been looking at her for months, the way that had an accumulation to it, a weight of time. "You've been doing more than helping since the first week." She didn't say anything to that. She picked up the letter and folded it carefully and set it on the shelf above the table. The shelf where Abigail's books were, where she'd put other important papers over the months, where it would be safe and findable. She was aware of Cole watching her do this, and she was aware that putting it on that shelf meant something, whether or not either of them said it aloud. "I'm going to tell Ruth," she said. "She'll want to know." "I know," Cole said. "And Patterson and the others." He paused. "Let me ride to Patterson. You take Ruth." It was a division of labor so natural she almost didn't register it as the thing it was. A partnership, the same easy splitting of a task that she'd watched other couples do her whole life without ever quite having it herself. She registered it now, quietly, the way she registered most things. "I'll take the wagon after lunch," she said. Ruth Harlan cried, which Elena had not expected. Not a lot. Ruth was not a woman who cried extensively about anything, but her eyes filled and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment before she composed herself. "Don't you dare laugh at me," Ruth said. "I'm not laughing," Elena said. She was not. "I've been worried about this valley for 6 months," Ruth said. "Every time someone's creek level dropped another inch. Every time someone sold a head they shouldn't have had to." She pressed her hands flat on her kitchen table. "I've been worried about it, and I didn't know what to do about it, and then you walked in here and you did the thing that needed doing." "You introduced me to your cousin," Elena said. "Without that, the document doesn't get filed correctly." "Don't diminish it," Ruth said, with a firmness that was affectionate and would not be argued with. "Just let it be what it is." Elena let it be what it was. They sat with their coffee and the determination letter between them and Ruth's kitchen, doing what Ruth's kitchen always did, holding people with a warmth that was practical rather than decorative, a warmth that was the direct result of someone caring for a space over a long time and it showing. "How are things at the ranch?" Ruth said after a while. The way she said it had something underneath it. "Good," Elena said. "Better than they were." "And between you and Cole," Elena looked at her coffee. That's a different question. It is, Ruth agreed. I'm still asking it. Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about how to answer it honestly, which required her to be honest with herself first, which was always the harder part. I don't know, she said. I know what I see. I know what I... She stopped. I know how things are. Whether that means something different than what it's been, I haven't decided yet. Have you talked to him? No. Why not? Because I came here with nothing and he gave me a home and work, and I don't want to make it into something. It isn't just because I'd like it to be more. She said it plainly, the way she said uncomfortable truths, without decoration, because decorating them didn't make them less true. He's a good man in a hard situation with 2 daughters and a ranch that's been running on the edge. The last thing he needs is to have to manage what I want from him. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Do you think he doesn't know? I think he might have an idea, Elena said. I don't think he knows what to do with it either. Then maybe, Ruth said, one of you should be the person who says the thing. Maybe, Elena said. Ruth refilled their cups, and the morning went on around them, and Elena drove back to the ranch in the afternoon sun with the determination letter in her bag, and Ruth's question riding alongside her the whole way. Sam. The celebration, such as it was, happened on Saturday. Ruth organized it, because Ruth organized most things that required people to show up in one place with a shared purpose. It was at the Harlan place, not a formal gathering like the water meeting, but something easier. Food on the tables outside, children running in the yard, the various ranches of the valley appearing in their various wagons through the afternoon. The Doyles came. Franklin Doyle shook Elena's hand, which was not a thing she had expected, and said, "You were right about the document, the timeline." He said it briefly and without elaboration, which was his way, and she accepted it briefly and without elaboration, which was the right way to receive it. The Aldermans came. Claire Alderman brought a pie and set it on the table and looked at Elena and said, in the tone of a woman who has made a decision she intends to honor, "My children's school is looking for someone to help with the upper grades in the fall. Reading and composition, 2 afternoons a week. I mentioned your name if you're interested." She paused. "If you can do fractions and water rights documentation, I imagine you can manage 12-year-olds. Elena looked at her. "I'll think about it," she said. "Thank you." Clara Alderman nodded with the nod of a business arrangement concluded and went to talk to someone else. Elena stood for a moment with the fact of it, that this woman, who had stopped her in the street to question her character 7 months ago, had just recommended her name for a position. It was not a simple arc, and it was not a complete one, but it was real, and real was the thing she'd always valued over clean. The girls were somewhere in the middle of the yard chaos, Nora's voice audible at intervals above the general noise. May appeared at Elena's side at one point, tucked herself against Elena's arm for about 30 seconds without saying anything, and then went back to whatever she'd been doing. It was the most May gesture in the world, and Elena felt it the way she felt most things from May. In the chest, deeper than she usually let things go. Webb was there, which surprised her slightly, because Webb at social gatherings was not a natural phenomenon. He stood at the edge of things with a cup and his usual expression of watchful reserve, and when Elena came to stand near him, he said, without preamble, "Water'll come back in the creek this summer." "The review thinks by August," she said. "Should have been handled before it got where it got," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it got handled." He looked at the yard, the people, the children, the food on the tables, the particular quality of a gathering where people have come through something together and are on the other side of it. "That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it's not nothing." He looked at her sideways. "You planning to stay on?" he said. "After all this settles." She looked at the yard. Nora had gotten into some kind of organized competition with the older Harlan girl that involved a rope and rules that kept changing. May was sitting with 2 other quiet children by the fence, apparently having a serious conversation about something. Cole was across the yard talking to Patterson, and he laughed at something Patterson said, a real laugh, the kind she didn't hear from him often, the kind that changed his whole face. "Yes," she said, "I'm planning to stay." Webb made the sound that meant he'd received information and filed it. Then he said, "Good," and went to get more coffee, And that was the end of that conversation. But it was also, she understood, the end of something else. The long period of his reservation, of his watching and waiting and withholding judgment. He'd delivered his verdict in one word, in his way, and she received it for the considerable thing it was. The conversation with Cole happened that evening. It was not planned. The gathering had wound down the way these things do, gradually and then all at once, the wagons going off in their different directions until the Harlan yard was quiet again and the last of the light was draining out of the sky. Elena and Cole had loaded the girls into the wagon, both of them half asleep, Nora listing against the side, May already gone, and driven home in the particular silence of a day that had been full and was now emptying. He put the girls to bed. She banked the stove and put the kitchen to rights, and she was standing at the window when she heard him come back down the hall and stop in the kitchen doorway. "They were asleep before I got the blanket on them," he said. "Long day." "Good day," he said. "Yes." She kept looking out the window. The dark outside was the deep, settled dark of a summer night that has decided on itself. The mountains invisible, but the sky above them lighter in a narrow band, some last holdout of the sun. "Cole." "Yeah." She turned around. He was in the doorway with his arms at his sides, and his expression was the one she couldn't always read. Not the everyday one, not the tired one, not the problem-solving one. The one that was underneath all of those. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is difficult." He looked at her. "All right. Do you want me to stay?" she said. "Not as the woman who manages the house? Not as the person who does the documentation and fixes the cellar door and helps with the girls' arithmetic?" She held his gaze. "I mean here, part of this, all of it." She stopped. "Because I need to know if that's what you want, or if I've been building something in my head that isn't what's actually in front of me." The kitchen was very quiet. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she felt the familiar fear of having said the true thing too directly and in the wrong direction, the old familiar sensation of a door about to close. Then he crossed the kitchen and he stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to see his face, and he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say it for 3 months." "That's a long time," she said. "I'm not fast," he said. "You know that about me." "I do," she said. "I knew it when you fixed the cellar door," he said. "Or maybe before that, when you sat up with May in the night, or when you went to the land office alone, or when you went to Doyle's." He shook his head slightly. "There wasn't one moment. It kept being true in different ways, and I kept not saying it because I didn't think I had the right to ask you for more than you'd already given." She looked at him. "You weren't asking, I was." "I know," he said, "and I don't know what I did to deserve the kind of person who'd do what you've done in this place. But I'm not going to pretend I don't want you to stay. I want you to stay. I want—" He stopped, and the stopping was more honest than the words would have been, because she could see what was in it, all of it, the girls and the ranch and the life they'd been living alongside each other, and the thing that had been building quietly in the space between them for months. "I want this to be your home," he said, "if you want it." She thought about this Hargrove door. She thought about the train platform and the $4 and the woman she'd been sitting on that bench, so hollowed out by disappointment that she'd almost stopped being able to imagine wanting anything. She thought about the note she'd written Nora and May before the land office trip. How ordinary it had sounded. How much it had sounded like someone who belonged somewhere. "I want it," she said. He put his hand against her face, the rough, careful hand of a man who has spent his life working and has never quite lost the awareness that some things are fragile. She put her hand over his. They stood there in the kitchen for a moment, in the stove warmth and the quiet, and it was not a perfect moment. She had learned enough to distrust perfect moments. They were always covering something. But it was a real one, with all the weight of the months behind it, all the work and the doubt and the fear and the choosing, over and over again, to stay. One. Spring came properly in March. The creek rose first, not dramatically, but steadily, the way water returns when the thing blocking it has been removed. Not a flood, just a return to what had always been right. Elena walked to the east field one morning and stood where the ice sheet had been in January and listened to the sound of water moving through the channel the way it was supposed to, and she felt something in herself do the same thing, return to a level she hadn't been sure she'd find again. The kitchen garden went in on the first warm weekend, and she did it with the girls, who had strong opinions about where the tomatoes should go and differing theories about whether carrots needed to be planted in rows or could be scattered and see what happened. She let them argue it out. Nora won, as she usually did. But May's expression when the first shoots came up weeks later in their careful rows said she had known she'd win all along and had simply let Nora have the satisfaction. She started the schoolwork with Clara Alderman's children in September. 2 afternoons a week, reading and composition. 12-year-olds who were at that particular age of being too old for easy authority and too young for real reason, which meant you had to find the third way, the one that treated them like people who had something to say and were worth listening to. She found that she was good at it, and not surprised to find that she was good at it, and not sure whether to be unsettled by how quickly this new layer of a life had arranged itself around her. The compensation claim went through the county agricultural office in the fall and covered most of what the Mercer Ranch had lost in the hard winter. Not all of it. These things never covered all of it. There were losses that couldn't be quantified and therefore couldn't be compensated, but enough that the margins changed, enough that Cole looked at the account book in a different way, with a different set of choices available to him. The Grint operation scaled back. He stayed. He wasn't required to leave, only to comply, and compliance was what the determination required. And the monitoring system went in on schedule, and the quarterly reviews proceeded with the tidy efficiency of a legal process that knows it is being watched. Elena did not feel satisfaction about this exactly. She felt something more neutral, the acknowledgement that a thing had been done and the doing of it had mattered, which was different from triumph and more durable. Webb fixed the south fence properly in spring, with Dixon Carver helping and Cole directing, and he did it well enough that Cole said it was the best that fence had looked in 10 years. Webb received this with his usual economy, but that evening he appeared at the kitchen door and ate dinner at the table with the family, which he had not done before, had always declined, always taken his food back to the bunkhouse. And he sat at the end of the bench and ate Ruth Harlan's tomatoes, which Elena had put up in September and didn't say much, but was there. She thought this was probably his version of saying something. What Elena understood by the time the second summer came and the ranch was different from the one she'd arrived at, not transformed, not perfected, but different in the way that things are different when they've been genuinely worked on, was that home is not a place you find. She had spent a long time believing otherwise. She had believed, in the way of someone who has moved through enough rooms that movement starts to feel like the point, that home was a destination, something you arrived at, something that announced itself, something you recognized because it was exactly what you'd been looking for when you set out. She had looked for it in Ohio, in the cities between Ohio and here, in Agnes's careful letters, in the Hargrove advertisement with its soft folds and its pleasant lie. What she understood now was that home was something you built, and not in the clean, purposeful way that word sometimes implies. Not a project you planned and executed. More like the way a water line gets repaired in the dark and bitter cold. One shift at a time, 2 people digging and 2 warming up, everyone doing their part in rotation, no one getting to do the whole thing alone and no one required to. It was the cellar door and the inventory list and the midnight milk and the land office trip and the document that took 10 days and the conversation in the field store that had to be had, and the conversation in the kitchen that had been 3 months coming. It was the girl falling asleep against her arm on a wagon road in the dark, and the note left on the kitchen table before a long trip, and the hand held against her face in a warm kitchen at the end of a good day. None of it had been easy. None of it had been tidy. She had been wrong about things, had misjudged things, had made decisions that cost her and others. She had been doubted and spoken about and dismissed and had to absorb all of that and keep working anyway, which was not a heroic thing but simply the thing that was required. And she had been given things. That was the part she had not expected to let herself receive. The giving. Ruth Harlan's open door, Webb's single word of verdict, May's 30 seconds of silent company against her arm, Cole's 3 months of trying to figure out how to say a thing and then finally saying it. You could not build a home by yourself. That was the truth she'd arrived at, and it was not a comfortable truth for a woman who had been building her own walls and repairing her own hinges for as long as she could remember. It required the other people. It required you to let the other people matter, which was the risk that all of it rested on, the one you had to take before anything else could be taken. In September, on a Sunday when the morning light was doing the thing it did in early fall, angling in low and gold and making everything look slightly more permanent than it actually was, Elena was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a letter she was writing to Agnes. She had been writing to Agnes in Cincinnati for 9 months, not the regular letters of their early friendship, but something more occasional and more real. The letters of two people who have both changed enough that the old frequency no longer fits, but the connection is worth maintaining in whatever form it takes. Agnes had written back in June to say she was expecting her second child, and in the letter there had been a line that Elena had read 3 times. "You sound like yourself. Not the self from before everything got hard, but a self I recognize." It's good to read. She was trying to answer that now, trying to find the right words for what the year had been, and what the place was, and what she was in it. And it was harder than documentation and harder than inventory lists because it required her to say true things in a language that didn't have technical precision to hide behind. Nora came in from somewhere and stopped beside her. "Who are you writing to?" she said. "My friend Agnes, in Cincinnati." Nora looked at the letter with the focused curiosity she brought to most things. "What are you telling her?" Elena considered. "That I'm good," she said. "That things are good." Nora looked at her. At 8 years old, she was still her exact same self. Direct, opinionated, occasionally insufferable, loyal in the fierce, unsentimental way of someone who has decided you're worth it and is not going to make a performance of that decision. And she looked at Elena now with the same expression she'd had on the train platform all those months ago when she'd walked up to a stranger on a bench and asked who she was. "Are you going to tell her about us?" Nora said. "Yes," Elena said. "What are you going to say?" Elena looked at the letter, at the half-finished sentences, at the particular difficulty of saying the true thing in the right words. She thought about what she would say about the girls, about Nora, with her decisive walks and her strong opinions, and the way she'd sat at the table and taken charge when Elena left for the land office. The quiet authority of a child who understood that someone had to hold things together and had decided it would be her. About May with her midnight questions and her careful rows of carrots, and her 30 seconds of silent company. "I'll tell her I found good people," Elena said. "That's the important part." Nora seemed to find this acceptable. She took a biscuit from the tin on the counter. She was always taking biscuits from the tin on the counter, and went back out, and Elena heard her cross the porch and go down the steps and call out to May about something in the yard. She looked at the letter. She picked up her pen. "What I would tell you," she wrote, "if I could say it simply, is that I came here looking for work and found something harder and better than that. I found people who needed things from me and let me need things from them, which is different from being needed in the way I was used to, which was a kind of needfulness that kept you at a useful distance. This is closer than that. Then it requires more and it returns more, and some days that ratio is very obvious, and some days it's invisible, and I've stopped needing it to be visible all the time. I don't know if that makes sense. I think you'll understand it. The girls are well. Cole is well. The ranch is—" She stopped and thought. "The ranch is exactly what it should be," she wrote. "Which is to say, it's not finished and it's not perfect, and there is always more work than there are hours in the day, and the creek that nearly broke everything last winter is running at its proper level again, and I had something to do with that, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise the way I usually would. I am well, Agnes. I am more well than I have been in a long time, and I know how to say that now without waiting to see if it holds." She set down the pen. Outside, she could hear the yard, the girls, the sounds of the ranch at work, the specific mixture of voices and distance and wind that she had come to know as the sound of this place, her place, the one she had not found but built, the one that had been built around her in equal measure by people who had decided she was worth building around. Cole came in through the back and stopped when he saw her at the table, which he still did. That slight pause, that slight adjustment, except it was different now than it had been in November. It was not a man surprised to find someone in his kitchen. It was a man who sees the person he was looking for and has found them where he expected them to be. "Letter?" he said, to Agnes. He poured a cup and came to sit across from her, the way he did in the mornings, the way he had done since before either of them had said the true thing out loud. He looked at what she'd written. She didn't cover it. And he read the last paragraph and didn't say anything about it, just set his cup down and looked at the window. "Creek's running good," he said. "I heard it this morning," she said, "when I checked the line." "You don't need to check the line every morning," he said. It's been running fine for months. I know, she said. I like checking it. He looked at her. The morning light was doing its thing, the low gold of early fall, and it was in the kitchen the way it came in at this hour, and she was aware of it the way she was aware of most things in this place. Not dramatically, not as a thing to remark upon, but as something that was hers to know. The particular light of a particular hour in a particular kitchen at the end of a long road that had started on a train platform with $4 and a broken promise, and a woman sitting alone on a bench in the cold trying to figure out what came next. What came next, it turned out, was this. I'm going to finish the letter, she said. I know, Cole said. He didn't move. Neither did she. The morning held them both in it, and the creek ran on outside at its proper level, and the girls' voices came through the window from the yard, and the house was warm, and the work was waiting, and there was time. There was time.